So yeah, we have some good New York Knicks news for this one. They're willing to take on a bad contract in a trade if you package assets in the move as well. Picks, maybe a young player, that sort of thing. And this happens all the time in the NBA, right? A team has a contract that they want to get off of. Bad team takes on the money. The original team gets back an expiring deal, which the Knicks have a whole bunch of in return. And the team taking on the money also gets some extra stuff. I think before we start speculating on specific moves and all that, I think this is a good sign for the Knicks because it just shows more of a savviness towards how to acquire assets. I mean, for so long we saw the Knicks giving bad contracts to guys or trading picks for guys. And I do think there's a way the Knicks could acquire some bad contract while still improving their team for the upcoming season because they have so much cap space. I think they only have like $40 million that's guaranteed to be on the roster. And that's all from Julius Randle, R.J. Barrett, Frank Ntilikina, Dennis Smith, Mitchell Robinson, and Kevin Knox. Everybody else is a team option. So the idea could be, I imagine the Knicks are probably talking to teams right now about this. Obviously they are. That's how this report came out. So for the Knicks, they could say, all right, we will accept Bobby Portis's team option of $15 million, and then we trade him to some other team for the contract they don't want, and then we get a draft pick to go with it. I guess Julius Randle is the other big contract, but I feel like Randle is good enough to where you don't have to trade him for a bad contract. You can trade him for just a good player, where some other team would really like Randle. I guess a Mo Harkless sign and trade could also be a possibility, because only the first year has to be guaranteed on those type of moves. But of course, Harkless would have to agree to that. If he doesn't want to do a sign and trade, then it doesn't happen. I've Googled the CBA rules on options and trades and all that, and based on everything I saw, you're allowed to do that sort of thing. If there is some sort of a loophole required, I'm sure NBA GMs know how to do it. Even if that sort of thing happens, the Knicks are still going to have a whole bunch of money, so then they could still in free agency go for Fred VanVleet or Joe Harris or anybody who you think could be really good for this team. And speaking on this free agent class a little bit more, yeah, it's not as great at the top, especially compared to next year's free agency, but there's also less competition in this one because everybody's planning for after next year, right? So the Knicks do have a bit of an opportunity where they can go to somebody like, I'll just keep saying Joe Harris, and they could give him $15 million a year, and with the Nets having to go over the luxury tax to keep Joe Harris, on top of the fact that they've got to deal with Jared Allen's extension coming up after this season, I believe, you might be able to steal a guy like that. Another one being Fred VanVleet, who I've already mentioned. I mean, of course, you're still not going to be the only team looking to sign some of these guys, but there's just less competition. And instead of you having to compete with 10 teams to sign somebody, you're only competing with like 4. So for whatever that's all worth. The other thing to make note of is this might throw a bit of a monkey wrench into the Chris Paul Knicks rumors because, I mean, is it possible that we could see a report like this and then they would still give up assets for CP? I mean, I guess it's possible, but I feel like this is kind of a writing on the wall sort of thing, which shows the Knicks' objective this offseason. I mean, if they think they can get a good point guard who's younger than CP and round out the roster without giving up assets, then that would probably be a better option, unless they think that getting Chris Paul would leapfrog them to the front of the line in terms of desirable free agent destinations. But even then, that's pretty risky with CP's age, health, and again, next year's free agency going to be super competitive. But at the same time, we should remember they hired Tom Thibodeau. And I don't think you hire Tibbs with the idea of, we're fine with, at the most, winning 30 games or something this season. I think this is also a sign that the Knicks could sign someone to a whole bunch of money for one season and then trade that guy by the deadline and look to get an extra asset. I mean, pretty similar to what they did with Marcus Morris this previous season. So we'll see what all that ends up meaning. But in terms of moves that the Knicks could actually make for these bad contracts to get assets back, Well, the first contract that I think of is Horford. The reason you wouldn't do it is maybe you just think Horford, Randall, and Robinson, it just doesn't work. But, I mean, if Horford was still good and he could space the floor out for you, then that could be intriguing. And I think you could, at minimum, you could get 1 first out of Philly for that. As far as what the move would be, I mean, Bobby Portis's money, like I brought up earlier, gets you pretty close to Horford's money. Well, actually, not by itself. You would need to throw in a little bit more money. Whether the Sixers would want Portis, I don't know. I feel like Philly is going to hope to get an actual floor spacer back for Horford's deal, and then they'd be content with offloading some picks. I think an underrated contract that a team would perhaps look to move is Taurean Prince with the Nets, because I think I mentioned this earlier. If they want to keep Joe Harris, they're going to have to go over the luxury tax, and they've still got Jared Allen's extension coming up. So getting out of Taurean Prince's money in 1 less season would be huge for them, and the Knicks can make that money work pretty easily. If the Bulls wanted to get out of Thad Young's contract, that's another one that's real easy. Whether these teams would be willing to give up picks for getting off of these guys, I think it depends on the team. Brooklyn, probably a better chance than Chicago. I wonder if Denver would give up assets to get off of Gary Harris's money, because they gave him that contract and he regressed quite a bit. Now, you could say that's just because of injuries. You could argue he's still essential for their team, but I imagine they're going to want to re-sign Jeremy Grant. They want to get MPJ some more minutes next season, I assume. And you could look at Gary Harris as a guy who is either a little too expensive or in the way of MPJ. I think it's an idea. And Harris has 2 years left. If he was an expiring, I wouldn't really mention it like that. I guess some people could think of Eric Gordon in this sort of thing, but I don't know if the Rockets really have any assets they'd be willing to give up. I would like to know how the Jazz front office deep down feels about Joe Ingles moving forward. He regressed this season. He's owed $24 million over the next 2 seasons, and I just wonder if they had an opportunity to give the Knicks something to get off of his money, if they wouldn't do it. So yeah, I mean, there are other guys who are on lengthier contracts, and perhaps you could find some, a random one is like Dwight Powell. Would the Mavs want to move off of him? Maybe, I don't know. So yeah, but like I said earlier, it's good to know the Knicks are willing to do this. It's also interesting on how they can do this sort of a thing, perhaps even more than once, and still have cap space. Although, of course, you don't want to put too many bad contracts on your roster. I figure I can tack this on to the end. It's not really as related to everything else I was saying, but would the Knicks look to move off of Ntilikina, Dennis Smith, or Kevin Knox this offseason? I guess the question would be, 1, does Tibbs think that he can build any of those 3 up? And 2, it's would other teams take him on? I mean, I don't know. The Dennis Smith's regression was really weird. Even if you didn't think he was that awesome, he at least looked okay before this season. He was bad this year. I feel like Ntilikina is going to become a Tibbs guy. I don't know if he's going to be good on offense, but we've seen how good he already is on defense. And in the case of Kevin Knox, I think it's too early to move off of Knox. He hasn't been good. There's no doubt there, but I don't know. I still feel like if you want to be positive enough, there's something there with Kevin Knox. His three-pointer in his first season wasn't bad. It was 34% on 5 a game. He grabbed about 4.5 rebounds. There's kind of something there. And maybe you could pull that out of him.